Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on some aspects of contemporary photography. Um, this is a tricky lecture to deal with in a lot of ways. After all, there is so much difference in a lot of things going on in the contemporary photographic world from, let's say, the 1980s or so forward, that there's no way that today's lecture is going to try to cover all of those major trends. What I'm trying to do today is give you some sense of some of the big players in the contemporary world of photography, people that have gotten a lot of critical attention and had a lot of impact on other photographers from, let's say, the late 70s or so forward to the contemporary day. And I've chosen the photographers that I have in large part not only because they're important figures in the world, but because they allow me to address various major theoretical or thematic trends that you'll find in contemporary photography. So have some fun with this. Obviously, it would be great if we could talk about everything out there, but I also have in mind the fact that if you are interested in a lot of things going on in the world of contemporary photography, take an art history course that's on contemporary art, and photography is everywhere to be found. Because one of the big trends, and I haven't included a ton of it today, but it's something you would find in other art history classes, in photography, one of these big trends is that photography is oftentimes used not discretely on its own as just a photograph, but is used in combination with other types of media. Sometimes we call this inner media. Sometimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, we call the process or the way you think of these things intermedial. It just simply means that, for instance, a photograph or photographic image might be used in combination with everyday objects or in an installation, or be used as a projection in some kind of installation, or, have any number of other orientations. Ever since the breakdown of kind of high modernism in the 1960s, the idea of using photography in various different formats and not just simply on its own has been something that is to be found everywhere. And we've already seen it in this class, obviously. When we were looking at art and identity politics, we certainly saw it when we were looking at the way that photography was used in combination with, already found images in the work of, for instance, Martha Rosler or even Andy Warhol. We're dealing with those questions as well. Another big component of contemporary photography, and this frankly is something that makes today's lecture not visually awesome, frankly, is that contemporary photography oftentimes is huge. With the advances of current technological processes, and in particular with the use of digital formats in photography, which is a huge part of this week's readings, thinking about what does it mean, instead of using analog photographic methods, to use digital photographic methods. What are the ontological differences between these? If something is purely digital, meaning virtual, is it the same as something that is analog? Can we even talk about digital photography anymore as an index of something else? In any case, there's a couple of things to this. When you have digital photography, you have new printing methods such as, first of all, types of laser printers, and nowadays really advanced color, basically bubble dot printers. You can print incredibly high resolution, really, really colorful, saturated color photographs that was never possible with the technology as it developed within film. And another component of digital photographic media is that, of course, you can manipulate the heck out of a digital photograph. There are a million photographic programs out there to do pretty much everything you want with a photograph, which then distends its connection to the real anymore. And this leads a lot of contemporary photographers to either use their photography in order to really reflectively question the photograph's connection to the real, whatever that might be, or, connection to an actual referent out there in the world, and its believability. And as we've talked about it, the idea of the photograph is creating a reality effect. So photographers today will be interrogating, criticizing, drawing attention to the ways that we have always believed in the illusion of photography, and that's a big trend. Another one is that photographers now adopting these formats that are so, again, distantly related to the referent, have felt it liberating. You don't have to worry about a photograph being connected to the real. You can, as Coleman put it in one of your optional readings, be the director of your photographic subject. You can make that subject up. You can create a fictive, kind of almost theatrical scene and photograph that. You can manipulate it in the darkroom, or I'm sorry, not in the darkroom, in your little slip there, manipulate it in Photoshop or any number of other photographic programs that can deal with digital photography. So you don't have that same kind of connection to the real either. So let's look at some of these photographers, knowing that it's not everything that we could cover, but these are some of the ones that I think are really interesting, and photographers that have had a huge impact on photography today. So the first one I'd like to start off with is Vik Muniz, who is a Brazilian-born photographer who has been pretty well known since the, let's say, late 80s, early 90s in the photographic world. What Vik Muniz is best known for is photographing scenes that he has put together. So for instance, here you see his studio. He's got he's basically projecting the image that you see underneath a photographic light stand of a nude boy next to these things that he's going to use to manipulate it. He creates the scene from already made images or from referring to paintings or other works of art, and then he photographs them. So for instance here is this work. This is a series of photographs that Vik Muniz made after Alfred Stieglitz's famous Equivalence series. Now remember, Stieglitz and the Equivalence was basically taking photographs of the sky, of clouds, which on the one hand were almost completely abstract, right? They're just these kind of close-ups of the sky and of clouds, and they're just, tonalities. They're just values of light and darkness. But he also wanted the idea to be that these photographs of the sky would create kind of emotional responses in us, or have equivalent responses in us when we looked at them, right? So it's about abstraction on the one hand. It's about us also freeing up the subject matter of photography so that it could be abstract. And it's also about giving a little bit of a nod to the viewer, who, just as we would look at clouds and kind of say, look, that looks like a bunny rabbit, or that looks like a face, or whatever, could do that with his photographs and find, through projection, some kind of inner state in ourselves. Now, what Vik Muniz does here is that he photographs pieces of cotton that he's manipulated to look a little bit like abstract shapes. And so here, this one's called the rower. And you look at this, and as soon as he gives you that cue, the rower, you might think of a man rowing in a boat. Now, he comes out of this tradition, of course, that is post-conceptual art, and so many, many photographers are thinking very conceptually in their image making. And this one's a case in point. Had he not indicated what this was with the title, The Rower, maybe the meaning of this, or the association you would have when you look at this, would be quite different. Maybe you'd think it looked like a snail or a bird. So by giving that caption, that immediately makes us interpret this in a very particular way, which is a reference to the way that, or one way to think of it is, a reference to the way that photography has always been captioned in a way. It's always been contextualized. Think back to some of the earliest, supposed documentary photographs that we saw of the Civil War, and how they gave meaning to the images that we were seeing, how they were oftentimes accompanied by some type of writing that would, again, secure their meaning, make us think about very particular things, and how that's quite different from the other component of photography we've kind of historically grown up with, and that's that the photograph is worth 1,000 words, that it doesn't need words, that it speaks for itself, that it's a direct, transparent kind of representation of its referent. In other words, what he's doing here is drawing attention to the way that photography is always a matter of projection and interpretation that we make sense of, like anything else, as a visible sign rather than something that's just a perfect, pure, transparent index of something else. The other thing, though, that Vik Muniz does a lot of, and as he once said, he said something like, what I'm trying to do is create the best illusion out of the worst possible kind of illusion. In other words, I want to trick you into believing that you're seeing something with the most minimal way of doing it, so that I can, you know that this isn't an actual rower, but your mind can't help seeing it. So as to draw our attention to the reality effect of photography, how we know that photographs aren't really, a document. They're not perfectly true. They always come from perspectives, but it's so easy for us to forget that. He wants us in the end, and this is a big part of a lot of Vik Muniz's art, to really question in a really broad way all representations we come across, especially visual representations, whether they be photographs or advertisements or movies or cinema or whatever it might be. So I'll show you a couple more of these, right? You look at this at first, and again, if you didn't have the title on this, you might even see elephant or something, but as soon as he says teapot, you can't help see it. That bell has been rung. Or hear the snail. Again, they're very simple things. He's just photographed pieces of cotton that have been minimally manipulated into seeming like there's something else. Now he moves on from that, and I just think this is so brilliant, into a series of works that he did, and it's not immediately following this, but a series of works he did almost 10 years later over Manhattan, in which he had a skywriter go up in the sky, and for a month that skywriter created these kind of cartoon images of clouds. And he called them clouds because, and this is where things, again, are very, very conceptual, very, very theoretical, but I love this. I just totally think this is great. On the one hand, this is an image of a cloud. In other words, it's a really simple, iconic sign of cloud. And on the other hand, it is an actual cloud. After all, skywriting is, creates basically clouds through evaporation. And so we have an image of a cloud which is made out of cloud itself. And by the way, who wouldn't want to wake up every morning and see this goofy little cartoon cloud over their city? He also does things like this, right? So one of the things that Vik Muniz has been interested in a long time is the question of how photography informs our memory, and how some images really stick with us and become iconic markers of particular moments in time. So I'd be surprised if people haven't seen this image before. It's a famous photograph from the Vietnam War of an execution of a suspected Vietcong sympathizer or soldier, and we have all the footage of this where the man actually gets shot, of course, and it becomes an image of the brutality of this war, an image of violence. It also, though, becomes a kind of icon of the 1960s, where, as I said, when we were looking at Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series, the proliferation of very violent images in the media was common. They showed up in Life magazine, Time magazine, on the nightly news, and we became a little bit desensitized to it. But in any case, Andy Warhol went at the question of what happens to us one way. The way that Vik Muniz comes at this is another way, which was to test himself, and he's a master, by the way, at creating illusions, to represent all of the images that were in Life magazine's Best of Life magazine from 1936 to 72, 50 images from memory, and see how good he could do it. What he was testing in a way is not only how photography informs our memory, but in what way are photographs an extension of memory? In what way do we rely on photographs as if they are our memories? And what does that mean then if they're only partial? So these are Vik Muniz's memory renderings of Saigon execution of a Vietcong suspect. This is how close he came to representing that, right? Pretty darn close. Or this famous scene from Vietnam, a napalm strike, right, in South Vietnam, and I think many people have seen this before, this horrible, horrible, very iconic scene of, once again, a huge mistake, and those mistakes happen often in war, but they seem to happen quite frequently and became lightning rods for criticism of the United States, both within and without of the United States during the Vietnam War, or Vietnam conflict, I suppose, is more accurate. In any case, people have seen this a million times. Maybe you become, desensitized to it. Maybe it makes you think back to those days. What does it mean to think, how much has this image impacted me? And if you have the ability to stop and draw it, how close can you get? And this is Vik Muniz's memory rendering of that picture. In a way, the simplification of this image, just down to that iconic girl running away, which is, for me, also the thing that I remember most about this image, can tell us something about how photographs are only partial, right? They only give you a little bit of the picture. They don't tell you all of the all of the things going on at this time, or all of the impacts of the events that they represent. Or the lunar landing, seen this a million times. On the left is the actual photograph. On the right is Vik Muniz's memory rendering. Or the memory rendering of the man stopping the tank in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, which is a very iconic image as well. This famous kiss, seen it a million times, right? How does it influence, impact our memory? What is the relationship between photography and memory, right? What is the relationship between representations in general and memory? After all, a memory is in itself a representation of the past. We always recall it in the present. We make sense of it in the present, even though it seems to refer to a past moment. Vik Muniz is also famous for these things, and this is in a very kind of broad way, one of the key components of contemporary photography, its materiality. Contemporary photography, rather than really emphasizing its transparency, meaning the way that the subject matter that is represented in a photograph just seems to be an accurate representation of the world, as if we're looking at the world rather than a photograph. A lot of contemporary photograph draws attention to its own materiality, to, visceral kind of stuff, either by combination of photography with other forms, or in this case, by creating a representation of a famous film still of Jackson Pollock, the famous painter who is known for drip paintings, a film still that was created by Hans Namuth. He takes that film still and he creates that image in chocolate. Yes, this is squeezed chocolate. So you can imagine, he actually used a different kind, but imagine taking Hershey syrup or something and squeezing it out to create this image of Jackson Pollock painting. Or Che Guevara here, created again out of chocolate and pieces of coffee that are in there as well. I mean, minimal illusion of something else. It doesn't really, it's not about a likeness of Guevara. It's more about this, creating an illusion out of something that is very clearly, not a drawing material. Or, again, you will have seen this. You spend some time with the little film clip that I gave you of an interview or a presentation by Vik Muniz, and this one, the Medusa Marinara, where he just, messing around with a plate of spaghetti creates an image of Medusa. And, on the one hand, it's pure fiction. It's obviously not reality. And on the other hand, it's pretty convincing as an illusion, or looks like something else. And then, of course, think of that in terms of this being finally a photograph of that original thing. So what I'm getting at here is something that runs through all Vik Muniz's work, which is I want to draw attention to the fact that photography is always already a representation. And this is an idea that's been around in painting forever, but not until, let's say, well, except for, let's say a few moments in time, it's not until the 1960s forward that a increasing kind of criticism or interrogation of the way that photography represents and of its truth value really was underway. So I wanted to show you this. Vik Muniz did a series of these so-called earth drawings. The funny thing is that what you're looking at here in all the way off to the left-hand side of this is a little line drawing created in the earth of a pipe. And it's a play off of the old earthworks that were done in the late 1960s, 1970s, like, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty or Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels or Walter de Maria's Lightning Field and things of that sort, which are massive, huge works, right? But he creates these really, really simple monuments, like a simple pipe here. In this case, it is a huge image that is created by that backhoe there. And then, of course, it's a reference to this famous painting by René Magritte, a Belgian surrealist who created this hyper-realistic picture of a pipe, and then beneath it, in French, put, "This isn't a pipe," by which he meant to say, this isn't a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. It's an iconic sign of a pipe, right? Representations are not the same as that which they represent. But what makes this even more interesting to me is that in many of Vik Muniz's earth drawings, sometimes there are these massive projects where you have to rent a backhoe and create this huge line drawing out in the middle of nowhere. And in other cases, he actually, in his studio, would create these little tiny scale models and create a line drawing of something and then photograph it. And of course, in photography, because they're just this little tiny kind of context that it gives you, you don't know whether what you're seeing is a huge scale or a small scale. The photographer can trick you in kind of profound ways into believing what you're seeing is something quite other than what it is. So for instance, Spiral Jetty here, 2010, it looks quite a bit like Robert Smithson's famous Spiral Jetty sculpture, but it was created with a little tiny studio set that he photographed. He created it in a studio, made it look like this thing and photographed it so that it's incredibly believable, but it's just this little tiny thing. Another major illusion that he plays around with, and I know these are super simple, but they are so appealing in real life, is he would create these line drawings, in this case, out of pieces of wire. There are many of these out there in different really simple shapes. This one's called Parcel. And they're just, again, they're using wire to create this illusion of a three-dimensional cube shape, a parcel, right? So they use the ideas of central linear one-point perspective to create this illusion. This is actually flat. It is not a three-dimensional form. And then they photograph this so that it becomes incredibly three-dimensional. And again, in a conceptual level, just try to think your way through this. It's a two-dimensional wire form that is rendered in a way using linear one-point perspective so as to look three-dimensional, and then photographed. And photography, of course, uses the basic ideas of linear one-point perspective and that one aperture that looks at things, remember our first week of classes, to make it look even more three-dimensional, and then he exhibits this as an illusion. Or these ones will knock you out if you ever see these in real life. They're crazy detailed. He created all of these basic drawings out of yards of thread, and they're after various artists. This one's after Gerhard Richter, who is a German neo-expressionist painter who is very well known for using photography in his own art. And everything that you're seeing here is just thread that's been unwound on the surface of the format. It's actually over the top of a light box and then lit in particular ways to make it look like a three-dimensional landscape. And he titles these, by the way, after the number of yards that is used of thread to create this incredible optical illusion for us. Or 16,200 yards after Corot here of the singer. They're amazing in real life, right? And then after he photographs them, the original object that he photographs is discarded. Now, a key moment in Vik Muniz's career was when he was down in the Caribbean and he was creating a project that was on the children of sugarcane workers. And what he did was he met with these people and he took photographs of these kids, and then he took those photographs and he used them to create these images, which are actually sugar. It's actual granules of sugar over the top of a dark format piece of paper or transparency that then he brushes around so that you create this incredibly realistic rendering of these children. And then he photographed those as his art. Now, at this level, he wasn't just playing around with the idea of illusion. One of the things that struck Vik Muniz at this moment in his career is a kind of social component to these works. He was looking at these children, and he was looking at their parents, as he put it, and you'll find this in the presentation that I asked you to look at, and frankly in the movie that I want you to watch, which is something I'll get to next. He looked at the children, he looked at the parents, and the children were all happy and exuberant, even though their life was really difficult. And the parents, after years of working very hard in these sugarcane fields for very little money, were just kind of broken down and had lost something of, as he put it, the sweetness of life. And so he rendered these kids in this really ambivalent subject, something that is all about sweetness, but also something that, is lacking from their parents. So it was very poignant to him, and he began thinking about, at this moment, he's very famous. He's made a career for himself. He's making a lot of money. How could he give something back to the world, right? After seeing these kids, he's making a lot of money. He grew up in a very, let's say, a lower middle class family. How do I give back? And he came up with this project. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great detail because I really, really would like you to watch this movie, which you have a link to on Canvas, which is Wasteland from 2010. In this project, just to give you a little summary, Vik Muniz returned to his home country, Brazil, and sought out a kind of social project and found it when he went to Garden Gramacho, which is the largest landfill, I believe, in the world. And he met these people known as pickers, who are basically recyclers of all the material that can be scavenged from this huge landfill and reused. And these are people who are, very lower class. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of other options in life other than the drug trade or prostitution or getting into gangs. And so they're working a pretty noble cause, again, within the trade of recycling, trying to give something back, trying to avoid a difficult, shouldn't say difficult, a life of crime or a life in, something that is probably a short-term fix. And yet it is an incredibly difficult life. And so what he did is he picked a few of these, several, I should say, of these pickers to come work with him in collaboration and create portraits of themselves, huge portraits on the floor of the studio, out of the very materials that they use to sustain themselves, recyclable materials. And then these portraits, oftentimes in the form, which is a big component of Vik Muniz's work, of famous paintings. In this case, this is Tiao, who is depicted as Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat painting. These were photographed by a large format camera, and then they were taken to London and sold at auction, and the money that they made at auction was given back to the people who collaborated with him. In any case, please watch that film. I think you'll enjoy it. Just briefly, and because they're so important to so many German artists who are oftentimes known as the Dusseldorf School, Bernd and Hilla Becher, I want to reference here. These two photographers, a husband and wife group, got famous starting in the early 1960s during the minimalist period in art by photographing in a really deadpan fashion these old industrial containers and factories and so forth, always the same way, always absolutely central in the photograph, always from the same height, always in kind of perfect light. They called this a new objectivity based upon a movement that kind of got run over by National Socialism in the 1930s, which was known in Germany as the Neue Sachlichkeit movement, also meaning new objectivity. And yet, at this time, what they were doing is very formalist, right? Very minimalist. Just taking a formula, like we're going to shoot this type of object from basically the same vantage point, always symmetrical in the composition, always with this kind of even lighting, and we're going to photograph as many of these things as we can over the course of our life. And this got very famous. They're quite kind of gorgeous formalist photographs. So I'll show you a few of these, right? Basically different containers, but the same thing in the same format over and over and over again. Just beautiful, very kind of machine aesthetic photographs of things. A number of Germans were influenced or direct students, including Andreas Gursky, who is one of the kind of hottest photographers out there today. Gursky has a very long career, so we're coming in this lecture to kind of the end point of his career, his third career, as some people put it, where he began to use, he started, by the way, as a documentary photographer. That's what he went to school for, and then he messed around a little bit with kind of art photography, and then he moved on to these digitally manipulated photographs that he's best known for. And probably you'll recognize this. This is one of a series of photographs that he took in California of a 99-cent store, or various 99-cent stores. Now, the thing about this is that when you look at this, on the one hand, by the way, these are huge photographs, 6 by 8 feet sometimes. When you look at this, it's just this kind of vibrant scene of tons and tons of color and tons of detail. And in real life, you can kind of read everything. They're just hyper realistic, and there's something really compelling about that. But it's not just one photograph that you're looking at. What he does is he photoshops together various different, or what they call suture together, various different photographs in order to create this illusion that you're seeing here of just mass abundance of consumer items. And that's the other thing that Andreas Gursky oftentimes gets spoken about in, which is that what he's commenting on, if it's anything, has to do with our society of consumption. That what you see over and over again, particularly in the works of the late 90s, early 2000s, are these scenes of massive abundance of just everyday consumer items that are, you know, as the title puts it, kind of worthless. They're, you know, each one of these things is $1, and they're everywhere, and people are buying these things. The other component of this is, though, it feels claustrophobic. When you see this, it kind of pens you in. It makes you feel like you're, and we are, surrounded by a society of consumption. Right? One after another, after another, after another, just more and more of this stuff. But he also does things like this, the, you know, Shanghai Stock Exchange, again, consumption in the background, huge photographs, by the way. In this case, that makes you feel like you are there in this scene. He has manipulated you. This is not the way that it looks, to make you feel like this goes on forever. And when you stand in front of him, right, you feel like you're in that space. Or the Chicago Board of Trade here. basically the stock market in Chicago. Again, about consumption, about this kind of society in which we are constantly in movement and scrambling to make a buck so that we can buy more stuff. That's the social commentary that people place on Gursky's work, although he's pretty quiet about what he's up to when it comes to what his intentions are. And on the other hand, of course, they dissolve into these kind of beautiful formal plays of, saturated colors and lots of line and movement, which is what I think really makes these, collectors' favorites. They're all, by the way, big cyberchrome prints. So cyberchrome is a very, very high saturation color process that allowed people that are working in digital photography to do something that people never could do very well in film photography, which is to get very, very vibrant saturated colors. So again, another scene of, in this case, a sports spectacle, or, something more simple in his oeuvre, Prada shoes, all about consumption. This library here surrounded by books, feeling kind of penned in here. And just to give you a sense of the scale of these things again. MercedesPlant and Rastatt, the assembly line. Again, all of these, and I've given you a little link to Gursky's, a little clip on Gursky's work, and they're all multiple different photographs of a particular place that have been sutured together so as to create this illusion of kind of more and more and more. Right. So then one more of these German artists who is deeply influenced by Berndt and Hilla Becher. This is Candida Hofer. And I only include Candida Hofer here because if you get a chance to see her huge format pictures, you'll really appreciate them. They don't work very well in this kind of small format. But just like her teachers, she, again, goes at things very, very deadpan, very kind of central focus on scenes usually of libraries or always architecture, such as the BNF Paris office here, number 7, or the library in Oslo here, or this one that I really wanted you to see, and this is more of her contemporary work, the communal theater in Carpi from 2011. This beautiful, beautiful theater that is shot pure central point perspective using that camera to give you an image of something that you couldn't really see on your own in this way. It just makes it look huge and even more monumental than it really is in everyday life. Let's spend some more time then on this local artist. This is Jeff Wall, who hails from Vancouver and has been shown in town quite a bit and is one of the most famous photographers since the early 1980s and continues to produce today. Jeff Wall represents a really intermediate approach or intermedial approach in which a lot of his photographs directly refer to the traditions of painting or the traditions of theater or the traditions of storytelling. And so what Jeff Wall is best known for is, again, creating fictive scenes that look real and then photographing these very meticulously. Early on, they're actual scenes that he photographs, just one shot, and more recently, over the last 10 years or so, what he does, maybe it's more than that now, is that he photographs multiple different scenes and then sutures them all together in this hyper-believable photograph. So the final thing is that if you've seen a Jeff Wall work, I'd say 95% of the time the format is the same, which is these are cyberchromic prints on transparencies that are then mounted on light boxes. So they have a rear projection lighting that creates this really, on the one hand, really realistic scene, but it's super simulacral too. In other words, it looks hyper believable, so hyper believable that it's not really believable. And you see the apparatus, the light box, that is lending it that added dimension of believability, which of course puts you on alert to not really believe it. So early on in his career, for instance, he got famous for works like this, Picture of Women, which is, and I'll toggle back and forth between this, a reference to a famous work by Edouard Manet known as Bar at the Folies Bergère, which you see over here on the right. And in the original painting by Manet, one of the things that Manet was commenting on was the way that these women barmaids, didn't get to partake in the society that they longed to be a part of, which was middle-class society of the 19th century, and were oftentimes solicited for sex and had to go along with it because they didn't have money to make ends meet otherwise. In the painting by Manet, which is, as we would say today, about the male gaze, you see a woman standing in front of a mirror, and in the background off to the right, you see her interacting with a man who exists in your space as the viewer. And that man is, we believe, probably soliciting her, or at least flirting with her. And she responds with this somewhat, not very happy look in return. And it's all about women being treated as commodities. In Jeff Wall's work, what he does is, on the one hand, he makes comments on the classical traditions of photography and, frankly, painting itself by dividing the entire photograph into very discrete thirds and centering the people's head right in the center of the photograph. These are all things that, if you took beginning photography, they would teach you to do. But off to our left-hand side, you see this woman standing in front of the studio itself, looking out at us much like Manet's figure, looking, let's say, less than happy to be stared at. And in the center of the picture, we see a camera that is looking at us, looking at her. And then off to the right-hand side, you see Jeff Wall himself holding, the shutter wire to trip the camera while looking, one presumes, into a mirror that then looks back at her. And what he's getting at here, on the one hand, is the large tradition of paintings and of photographs that partake in the objectification of women, what we generally call the male gaze. He's talking also about the way that in our contemporary world we're constantly feeling like we're being surveyed, either being looked at by other people, looked at by cameras, constantly on the alert that we might be photographed in one way or another. So it's a kind of social commentary. And he did this a lot, right? This kind of reference to famous photographs and commentaries on things. These are all scenes that he constructs. So in the Destroyed Room from roughly the same time period, the late 70s, he constructs this destructed room, this destroyed room, and you can tell the fiction. Look off to the left-hand side. It's clearly a stage set. But everything else in here makes it look like a woman's room, because it's women's clothing all over this, has been torn apart, the bed shredded, the walls been torn apart, the drawers have been pulled out, as if some scene has unfolded. And we're left, like photographs often leave us, wondering what this is evidence of, what event this is an index of, while also being alerted, because of the fiction that he points to, that this is a fiction. But he's also referring to the traditions of painting here as well, and the way that photographs are coded, meaning they have their own visual codes that allow us to read them. And the painting that he's referring to here on the right-hand side of your screen is Eugene Delacroix's The Death of Sardanapalus here, a famous Romantic painting in which Delacroix represented this Assyrian general who, on the eve of his impending defeat by other armies, decided to gather into his bedchambers all of his possessions and have them burned up, massive destruction. Now, is the scene on the left like a reference to destruction, something that's already happened, an after scene for, the death of Sardanapalus? Probably it's not that one-to-one. Instead, what he's doing is drawing attention to the visual cues of what says destruction or what, again, the way that we have to read a photograph rather than it just being a pure indexical sign of something. Other social commentaries in his work. Some of these are very directly based, when you see his work, just keep this in mind, some of these are very directly based on experiences that he had. And because he was, very immersed in art history, he knows that a lot of painters through the ages will take their experiences and distill those into a painting, a la the realist tradition of someone like Courbet. This one, called Mimic, from 1982, again, all of these photographs that you're seeing are printed on cyberchrome transparencies in a light box, so they're very fictive, but also very believable. Shows you a man and a woman walking down the street. Because it's a photograph, we're asked in a way to look very carefully at who they might be, what their relationship is, the type of clothing that they're wearing, what social class this might make them a part of, and then to think about these stereotypes in relation to what this man in the middle is doing, which is looking over at the Asian man who's slightly better dressed, looks, let's say, a little bit more put together, and the guy in the middle is putting his hand up to his face, and he's basically flipping him off, but he's also slanting his eye at him, right? So it's a racial slur that we're seeing, combined with all of these social cues that we're there to read. Or the Outburst. I'm not going to interpret this for you, but, it's him, again, distilling various stereotypes into this very, very, on the one hand, hyper-real, almost, well, here's the best way to put it, I think. This is like Cartier-Bresson's The Decisive Moment, but it's a total fiction. He hasn't caught the moment in time that speaks to what happened before and what will happen afterwards, like that really, really loaded visual image. He's constructed it. He's made it all up. He's gotten actors. He's got a studio set. He's lit it exactly the way he wants it. He's framed it exactly the way he wants it. And then he says, roll camera, and he clicks the shutter, and he captures this supposed decisive moment. And in this way, it is a commentary on the whole idea of photography, of having to be attached to the real. And on the other hand, it's his commentary on, in this case, sweat labor, inequities in one presumes third world countries, or sweatshops in the United States, perhaps, or in Canada, or any number of places. More recently, these works have gotten pretty famous. Dead Troops Talk, A Vision After an Ambush of a Red Army Patrol near Mokur, Afghanistan in the winter of 1986. They're, again, staged tableaus, imagining the scene of, in this case, a tragedy, and making us think about the entire tradition of war movies and war photographs, and how these do and don't appeal to us, and what their connection is to the real. Or a work that garnered a ton of attention because it took so long to create. This is called The Sudden Gust of Wind, after a famous work by the Japanese artist Hokusai from 1993, and he shot this over months, and it's, I forget how many different photographs that have been spliced together, but you can probably see all these pieces of paper flying through the air everywhere, and he shot different photographs and then spliced them all together to get, and this is the irony of this thing, this one moment in time in which something occurred, that decisive moment, that is, of course, a distillation of months and months of photographing thousands of pictures that are spliced together. Right, it's after this famous series. It's actually a series by Hokusai. Or this. This is the University of Washington, old Odegaard. Frankly, it's a, of course, photoshopped image of a giant in the middle of the landings. This has all been changed in its format. Or things that are just open to interpretation since the late 80s, 90s, over and again. the meaning of these works of art, sometimes you can attach them to famous paintings. Other times they're just like these really, really resonant images that make you think of a story that's about to be told. There's something that seems very familiar, and I've seen people stand in front of these, for many minutes talking to their neighbors, trying to distill what these things can be about. Right? The storyteller itself. What's going on here? So I want to wrap up this lecture with, I made mention of this technique or this approach when we were looking at identity politics. So I wanted to kind of come back to it by one of the most famous of its practitioners, Krzysztof Władicko, who's a Polish-born artist who has been using his projections of photographic images for social instrumental purposes for a very, very long time, and he's someone that I deeply admire. He got famous for doing, for instance, images like this. It's a photographic projection, and a lot of artists do this today, either in galleries or on buildings or on night skies or what have you, right? The technology is around that we don't need an actual printed photographic image. We can actually just project these with high-powered projectors. And in this case, what he did was, this is in 1985. And this is the South Africa House, basically the House of South African Diplomats in London, which is in an area, a huge square, that is filled with diplomatic houses. And forever, of course, people have been putting pressure in the 80s on South Africa to end apartheid. Apartheid is this separation government in which it was just a part of the standard kind of order of things that black culture really had no say in politics and were treated as second-class citizens, and the white political structure as it existed, apartheid, continued to just say this is the way it's going to be, until, of course, international pressures mounted to such a degree that they had to change this. But while this was still going on, of course, a lot of people were really, really upset with major superpowers for not ending apartheid, for not putting enough sanctions on South Africa, for allowing business to continue as normal, for South Africa to pretend like it wasn't a totally racist country of the time. And so in order to kind of draw our attention to kind of the hidden components of apartheid, what Władicko did was that from the other side of the square, he projected on the facade of the South Africa House this swastika at night from 300 yards or so away, so as to say, within this government there is a very, very Nazi element that he recasts the diplomatic offices as Nazi. It's almost as if you're using something like photographic projections in the way that the collage artists used collage to recontextualize an original image, to make some component of that original image or that original meaning change by drawing attention, in this case, to its relation to fascism, to Nazism in particular. Or closer to home, Władicko in 1988, in the midst of the George H.W. campaign, created this work, a projection on the Hirshhorn Museum called Works. And what he did here, it's a reference to the political campaign of George H.W. Bush, who was running against Michael Dukakis. And one of his big campaign promises was 1,000 points of light, as he said, a promise, a very Christian idea, which you see in the candle in one hand, and the very clear, wedding band on that hand, all about family values. And then on the other hand, he got a gun there, and that gun is a reference to another big campaign here, where Michael Dukakis, who was his Democratic opponent, was linked to the release of a prisoner known, his name was Willie Horton, and Willie Horton was let off on a kind of work release program mistakenly, and he committed a murder. And of course, this was used to show how Democrats were soft on crime, you know, that if you put this man into office, he was going to release all, you know, because he's a bleeding heart liberal, release all the criminals, and it's just going to lead to, you know, a world in which you're not safe. And so it's the dual kind of political program that we see used a lot by both sides, but in particular by people on the right, which is we're very, very Christian, we're all family values, and by the way, if you elect the other side, you know, everything is going to go to hell, so it's also a threat thing. And then right in the center of this whole thing, of course, are the microphones to draw attention to the fact that, of course, this is all just a political play. It's all just political intrigue and political theater. It's not, no one really believes this. Finally, just last, I'll say that he does these types of projections all the time. This is a projection of a crutch on the statue of Lincoln here that had to do with a series of war memorial statements that were also played at the time of veterans talking about, you know, all the difficulties that they've had since coming back from wars and how the U.S. government hasn't really, you know, taken that into account, which is still a problem today. Well, this doesn't represent, of course, nearly everything going on in the contemporary world of photography. That is a huge, huge, you know, field, but hopefully it gives you enough information or enough different approaches in contemporary photography that you can make further sense of all the wonderful, rich things that are going out there today. All right. See you next week.